Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining the Wilson Center's Maternal Health Initiative for this panel discussion on gender-based violence in conflict and humanitarian settings. I'm Sarah Barnes, and I direct the Maternal Health Initiative at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This event is part of a Wilson Center series exploring the many facets of gender-based violence around the world, in parallel with the UN system's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence that runs every year from November 25th, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, until December 10th, which is Human Rights Day. Several Wilson Center programs have co-sponsored this event. Thank you all for your support of this really important discussion. At the Maternal Health Initiative, or MHI, we focus our work on improving the lives of women and girls through convenings like today, through research, and through actionable ideas. We look globally at the health, equity, and security of women and girls, which makes gender-based violence a very real component of the work that we do. And to make that connection even clearer, studies have shown that femicide, the killing of a woman or girl based on her gender,
Okay, I believe that we lost Sarah for the moment. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Beth Schlachter, and I'm Executive Director at FP 2020. And part of what Sarah was going to help us do was set the stage for today in sharing the Wilson Center's work, and also that this event is in memory of Jen Schlecht, who was with us last year at a Wilson Center event. So Sarah, I'm going to turn it back over to you now. Well, maybe we should just move forward. I know that Sarah really wanted to share what the Wilson Center's motivation is for today. Dakshita, do you want to step in while we're waiting for Sarah, or should I just go forward? Okay, let's go forward. So again, part of what Sarah was going to share today is how this group has come together. Last year, the Wilson Center held an event on providing sexual and reproductive health care for women in humanitarian settings, and each of the organizations that you see here today participated in that event. Tragically, a few weeks after the event, our colleague from FP 2020, Jennifer Schlecht, was killed by her husband in an incident of gender-based violence alongside their daughter, Abinesh, who was 5 years old. So the Wilson Center this fall, in thinking about one of the events that they wanted to do, wanted to honor Jen's legacy and work, and I'll speak a bit more about that in a moment. By putting this panel back together, the same organizations bringing us forward in this work, but this time talking about gender-based violence, particularly about intimate partner violence and sexual violence, since we know that incidents of those all increase during times of displacement or crisis, and particularly now in ways that we're experiencing around the world because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's my honor to have this opportunity to moderate this panel on the critical topic of gender-based violence in humanitarian settings. The FP 2020 partnership is working together for a future where all women and adolescent girls everywhere have the freedom and ability to make their own informed decisions about using modern contraception and whether and when they want to have children. Also, how they can lead healthy lives and participate as equals in society and its development. At the heart of rights-based family planning is the ability of women and girls to decide freely and for themselves if and when they want to become pregnant, and then to have the freedom to exercise that right by having access to information and a range of contraceptive options. But the rights of women and girls are fundamentally undermined when they're subjected to gender-based violence, as is all too often the reality in the lives of women and girls, especially those who are displaced by natural disaster, conflict, and other crises. I want to share a few statistics that were recently published by UN Women to help set this global context, because I'm sitting here in Northern Virginia in the United States, but this is something that women around the world have always experienced and continue to experience. So it's in solidarity with all women and girls that we're talking about this issue today. And in saying that as well, we want to recognize that boys are also victims of sexual violence and violence within the family, even as we focus on women and girls today. So globally, 35% of women have ever experienced physical and or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner. Some national studies show that the number can be as high as 70% of women, and that rates of depression, having an abortion, and acquiring HIV are higher in women who have experienced this type of violence compared to women who have not. 137 women are killed by a family member every day. That's a staggering statistic. And it's estimated that of the 87,000 women that were killed intentionally in 2017, again around the world, more than half of these women, 50,000, were killed by an intimate partner or a family member. Violence against women is known to increase during times of crisis, as I mentioned, and has increased significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Calls to helplines have increased fivefold in some countries as rates of reported intimate partner violence increase because of the pandemic. Restricted movement, social isolation, and economic insecurity are increasing women's vulnerability to violence in the home around the world. In 2017, FP 2020 expanded our scope to address the need for family planning in crisis and fragile settings under the leadership of Jennifer Schlecht, who, as I mentioned, was killed 1 year ago, along with her cherished daughter, Abinish. Jen devoted her career to ensuring that women and girls in crisis situations have access to the best possible medical care, including family planning and other reproductive health care. She was a vital and beloved part of the FP 2020 family. In honor of her mission to extend family planning to women and adolescents affected by crisis, as part of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care, FP 2020 continues to partner with governments, humanitarian, and development actors around the world to raise the profile of and access to voluntary contraception everywhere. An example of how our work addresses the insufferable scourge of GBV is our efforts in South Sudan to help develop a costed implementation plan for scaling up access to voluntary modern contraceptives and to address GBV. South Sudan has an exceptionally high incidence of sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV, and these types of offenses are unpunishable. This absence of social protection exposes women and girls to the risks of forced marriage, sexual slavery, and systematic rape. Sexual violence against women appears to be normalized in this context due to years of war and conflict and often goes unreported, which has several cascading effects. For instance, SGBV survivors experience stigma, which limits their opportunities to and access to healthcare, counseling, and to legal support services. SGBV survivors also face a greater risk of HIV. Additionally, given the deeply ingrained patriarchal society, this sets up a context in which norms like intimate partner violence and other types of SGBV are accepted and continue to happen. These outcomes illustrate an array of barriers to women's access to family planning and undermine efforts to expand access to information about and services for family planning, among a range of other services. Last year, during the ICPD at 25, the government of South Sudan committed to developing a progressive legal and policy framework to address sexual and reproductive health and rights and GBV. The government of South Sudan planned to enact regulatory laws for nursing and midwifery to improve maternal health care, as well as enact a GBV law by 2020. The ICPD 25 commitment also addressed the country's commitment to providing comprehensive age-appropriate information on sexual and reproductive health that meets the evolving needs of individuals. It would also include gender-based violence, sexually transmitted infections, including HIV/AIDS, to enable young people to make informed decisions as they transition into adulthood. With financial support from FP 2020's Rapid Response Mechanism and technical assistance from Palladium, the government of South Sudan is developing a costed implementation plan for family planning scale-up and intends to include addressing GBV as a part of this plan. As countries around the world continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, as climate change and complex emergencies continue to displace ever more people, FP 2020 commits to forging partnerships and fostering country commitments that ensure that the universal rights to sexual and reproductive health care and freedom from SGBV are upheld. Our panelists today offer an array of insights into how sexual and gender-based violence is being addressed in humanitarian settings as we make progress toward universal health care. So I have the honor of moderating the panel, and I'm going to introduce them one by one, and they'll share some about their work. We'll ask a few questions of each other, but you all have the ability to submit questions so that we can have some of your questions addressed too. So please submit those questions to mhi@wilsoncenter.org. And please include your name and your title and your affiliation as you submit questions so that we know who you are as part of this discussion. So now it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to Joan Timoney. Joan is the Vice President of Advocacy and External Relations at the Women's Refugee Commission based in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining WRC in 2005, Joan was Vice President for Programs of the Partnership for Public Service, a nonprofit organization she helped to launch, and which is dedicated to revitalizing the federal civil service and inspiring a new generation to serve. And we need that now more than ever, Joan. So thank you for your work. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and hello to everybody that's joining us. I want to thank the audience today for joining us for this. I want to say a special word of thanks to the Wilson Center for doing this event to honor Jen, and for Beth's comments as well. She was an extraordinary person, and I had the privilege of working with Jen at the Women's Commission. So to set the stage for the conversation today, what I want to do is talk about a global initiative to address GBV, something called the Call to Action on Protection from Gender-Based Violence in Emergencies. And as Beth said, we know that GBV is a horrifying reality globally, spikes in crises, and we've been reminded of this in a particularly awful way, I think, during this COVID period. So taking action on gender-based violence is central to the humanitarian mandate. It's a collective responsibility, and it's something that every humanitarian actor needs to take on and do their part. But GBV has not always been seen as a priority in humanitarian response. And business as usual wasn't really going to change that. So a founding group of partners came together in 2013 to form the multi-stakeholder Call to Action. And the aim of the Call to Action is to fundamentally transform the way GBV is addressed in humanitarian settings. So the members of the Call to Action, as I said, it's multi-stakeholder. So it includes states, mainly right now, the leading donor states. It includes the UN agencies, international organizations such as the UN agencies, International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. It includes NGOs. I think all of us on this panel today represent organizations that are part of the Call to Action. Mainly the NGOs are INGOs, but we have a growing number of national partners and really look forward to seeing that increase. I think that's an important imperative for this effort. The lead of the Call to Action is the state, and it rotates. So Canada has been the lead of the Call to Action for the last 2 years, and will be transferring the leadership to Denmark in January, for Denmark to lead for 2 years. So the Call to Action was, as I said, initially launched in 2013 by a group of founding partners, and it was launched with a communique. And then we founding partners said, you know, we really have to develop a sort of concrete framework that's going to guide our collective action and advocacy. And so we developed a Call to Action roadmap. And we're in the last year of that roadmap now. And we've certainly seen important progress, but as all of you know, it's not fast enough, it doesn't reach far enough, it doesn't really go deep enough. So we've made a commitment, we've updated and extended the roadmap for another 5 years so we can really double down on this work. The updated roadmap sets out some core principles that are really foundational to our collective efforts. And so this includes, for example, starts, of course, with accountability to the people we serve, but also accountability of humanitarian actors within the system to addressing the issue. There's a principle around that inextricable link between gender inequality and GBV, so that if you're not addressing inequality, you're really not getting at the root causes of gender-based violence. We affirm as a core principle that the initiative has a priority focus on women and girls. And we also affirm that an intersectional approach is absolutely critical to effective programming. So taking into account all those different characteristics an individual has that may increase or mitigate their risks, whether it's ethnicity or gender identity, disability, and so on. And we have as a foundational core principle that the engagement, participation, and leadership of women, women's organizations, absolutely critical to the work. So if you think about those principles and the need for transformative change, I'm going to walk you through a brief overview of what the substance of the roadmap is. So the goal is that every humanitarian effort from the very start, so that's the emphasis, right? Not when we get to it, not when we take care of the other things first, but from the very start, provide safe and comprehensive services for GBV survivors and includes measures to prevent and mitigate the risks of GBV, especially violence against women and girls. So there's 3 objectives related to that goal. The first one is to get those specialized services for GBV survivors in place right away from the start. The second is to make sure that you're integrating prevention and risk mitigation in all sectors of humanitarian work. So whether that's you're delivering food or you're helping with shelter or providing water and sanitation, are you doing in a way that prevents and mitigates the risks to beneficiaries of GBV? And the third one comes back to that gender equality point. The third objective is mainstreaming gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls throughout humanitarian action, so that you're really getting at that root cause of GBV. And there are 6 areas of work in the roadmap, and I'll just very quickly go through those. But if you think about what is a really quality GBV response effort look like? First, that actors have the institutional policies in place in their own organizations to do the work, and that's true for the humanitarian system too. Second, that we have strong coordination. You've got to have good coordination on the ground, on GBV, in humanitarian response to have an effective response. The third one relates to data. The safe and ethical collection of data on gender-based violence and gender issues that is not only collected, but perhaps, and equally importantly, I guess, is actually used to inform planning, programming, monitoring. The fourth one, of course, relates to funding. Got to have that sufficient funding in place. The fifth one relates to those specialized services I mentioned for survivors, and the sixth relates to risk mitigation. So partners make measurable commitments under those areas of work, and they report annually on their progress, so we have that accountability built in. And we've seen progress in the first 5 years, but as I said, there is so much more to be done and areas that needed added emphasis. For example, that engagement with local partners. So that's why localization in the updated roadmap appears under every single outcome of the roadmap. I encourage people listening today who are not members of Call to Action, but are active in humanitarian response to please think about joining. The website is www.calltoactiongbv.com. And I can feel the timekeeper like looking at me intently. So I'm just going to end with one quote, something I heard the head of UNICEF say at a Call to Action event that I thought reminded us all of what the charge is. And she said, "We can't always control whether or not humanitarian emergencies happen, but we can control how we prepare and how we respond, how we support survivors, how we support local women's groups who are the first responders, and how we prevent GBV from happening in the first place." And I think that's the charge to all of us, the call to action, and indeed to all humanitarian actors. So I'll just stop there and look forward to hearing from my colleagues that are doing the work on the ground. Thank you all.
Joan, that's a great call to action and then inspiring remarks as well about controlling those things that we can control so we're ready for the uncontrollable. And if this COVID moment does anything for us globally, I think it should unite us in an understanding, profound understanding of what a lack of preparedness can mean when a crisis hits. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Christina Hanif. Christina is an emergency response specialist on gender in emergencies with CARE's Rapid Response Team. And she's deployed to Mozambique, Sudan, and Uganda, and more recently is supporting the COVID-19 response in Asia Pacific. Prior to joining CARE in 2018, Christina worked in a number of regional and country level roles focusing on protection, gender and inclusion with the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Societies in Asia Pacific. So Christina, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Beth, for the introduction. I just say a big thank you to Sarah and the Wilson Centre for organising this event and having CARE to be a part of this panel. It really is a privilege to be part of this event today. Just wanted to give a brief overview of CARE's approach to gender-based violence in emergencies, and then showing how that plays out in the field with one example from our integrated interventions in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So for over 2 decades, CARE has been addressing the root causes driving gender-based violence and caring for survivors. And we believe that every person has the right to live a life free from violence. So to realise this, CARE places gender equality and a focus on women and girls as central to our mandate and also central to our humanitarian strategy and our approach. So because of this strong focus on women and girls and gender equality, CARE's GBV work is really rooted in its broader gender and emergencies approach, as well as in crisis programming in development settings. One of the core components of CARE's gender and emergency approach is to conduct rapid gender analyses. And we see gender analysis as really as paramount to understanding in real time the distinct needs, concerns, priorities, and capacities of women, men, boys, and girls, and at-risk groups and communities affected by crisis. The approach understands the rapid and changing nature of humanitarian crises and the critical need to have information quickly to ensure that we can inform our programming, including for GBV prevention, mitigation, and response, and all the while ensuring that we do no harm through the interventions. As a result of COVID this year, we've seen RGAs take place across 54 countries in both humanitarian and development settings experiencing the pandemic. Another core component we have focuses on women's leadership. So CARE recognises the critical gap and the social, structure and economic barriers to women's leadership and meaningful participation in humanitarian crises, and the impacts that this has on both the design and the implementation of response programming, in that it often doesn't reflect the voices and the priorities of women and girls and at-risk groups. And then this has impacts on access to GBV services, information, and the mitigation of risk in humanitarian crises. And this is a gap recognised by many humanitarian actors. And as such, CARE is working to try and address this through our Women Lead in Emergencies approach. So the Women Lead in Emergencies approach has the ultimate goal of addressing the principle of meaningful participation by supporting local women's groups affected by crises, addressing the barriers that they face, and supporting the actions that they wish to take to make decisions that affect them and their communities. And this approach again incorporates a rapid gender analysis, but specifically focusing on power dynamics and community level decision making and leadership. So bringing these components together, CARE has a core set of interventions to prevent, mitigate and respond to GBV. And this includes the creation of safe spaces, so for the protection and empowerment of crisis affected women and girls, providing adequate and appropriate gender sensitive sexual and reproductive health services, including the clinical management of rape, working with communities to shift patriarchal social norms and address the root causes of violence, as well as the exacerbating factors that we see in times of crisis. And then ensuring we engage with men and boys. So ensuring men and boys are engaged in GBV prevention, awareness raising, and behaviour change initiatives to discuss challenges and challenge stereotypes to masculinity. So one example that highlights the intersections of these different interventions is in our Cox's Bazar Bangladesh programme. Since 2017, CARE has been responding to the Rohingya refugee crisis in Cox's Bazar, where over 900,000 Rohingya fled to the border regions in Bangladesh. An initial rapid gender analysis in 2017 really highlighted the need for humanitarian programming to be gender sensitive and gender responsive. And it noted the high protection and GBV concerns in instances in Myanmar en route to Bangladesh, and that continued, the high risk that continued in the camps when in Bangladesh. During this rapid gender analysis, all respondents reported either knowing a survivor of violence or having been witness to an incident. So this was and continues to be today disproportionately affecting women and girls, with the most recent rapid gender analysis in October 2020, so in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, showing that GBV concerns still remain high and have been now exacerbated by COVID-19, leading to a further increase in GBV. Particularly intimate partner violence, polygamy, transphobic violence, and violence against female sex workers, whilst at the same time the services being delivered were becoming more and more restricted. So because we know that most forms of GBV lead to health and psychosocial outcomes, since 2018, CARE has implemented an integrated model in Cox's Bazar, and this has included provision of basic health services and mobile health outreach units within the camps. And this provides psychosocial support for gender-based violence survivors, maternal health care and family planning, as well as onward referrals to primary healthcare centres. And the mobile teams were established based on feedback from women and girls in the community, particularly from adolescents who noted that they faced severe mobility restrictions, which was impacting their access to health services. So the programme also supports 12 women and girls safe spaces, which provide gender-based violence case management services, sexual and reproductive health services, and psychosocial support activities. And the safe spaces also offer time for critical reflection and dialogues on gender issues, including discussions on social norms that can affect gender-based violence. We have awareness raising on the availability of these services that take place through 14 different outreach teams, both at the household level and the community level. And this includes the engagement of men and boys, key family members and community stakeholders, noting the importance of working in a holistic and all of a community approach. So as of October 2020, close to 12,000 individuals, male and female, have been reached through gender-based violence services and information through this programme. And CARE's continue to do learning and document evidence of the approach, and as a result of this, does continue to advocate for such an integrated approach for gender-based violence and SRH to be able to holistically meet the needs of women and girls in crisis settings. Thank you very much. Now I'll hand back over to Beth.
Thank you so much, Christina. Now we're fortunate to have with us Jeanette Umkam, and Jeanette leads the Building Local, Thinking Global Coalition at the International Rescue Committee. And she brings together feminists, women's rights organizations, national and regional GBV networks with the aim of harnessing collective power within the humanitarian community to ensure that women and girls are protected from GBV in emergencies. Jeanette has over 13 years of experiences in GBV, women's protection and empowerment, adolescent girls, feminist partnerships, and GBV emergency preparedness and response programming in South Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. Jeanette, it's a pleasure to hear from you today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you so much for these opportunities. Hi, everyone. Warm greetings from Nairobi to you all, and really a pleasure and honor to be with you all here today. Today, I will be sharing lessons learned during the implementations of the IRC GBV work in emergency in collaboration with women rights actors and networks, in particular through this incredible project that Beth just mentioned, the Building Local Thinking Global project. I will refer to them as BLTG in short from now. The project funded by BPRM for the last 3 years that has been co-implementing with feminist, women rights organizations, and networks since 2017, with the aims of harnessing collective power within the humanitarian communities to ensure that women and girls are protected from GBV in emergency. Before I share my lesson learned, I also would like to also honor the networks and organizations that leading this initiative together with the IRC in this forum. The leading organizations and networks together with the IRC are the Agina Mama wa Africa, the GBV Prevention Network, the Women International Peace Center, and the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horns of Africa. They're based in East Africa. Together with also Gender Equalities Network based in Myanmar and the El Karama networks based in the Middle East. In my presentation, I will focus on the key lessons learned through the implementation of this project and how the ongoing work with women rights organizations in East Africa and in the Middle East and in Asia impacted in response to GBV during the COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic, together with the introduction from Beth, the global emphasis on the call to action from Jones, and we also have a very important pictures on the magnitude of the problem with Christina for the gender analysis that she just presented. So we already have seen the gender in its consequences and experiences that women and girls are at the front line. And as many data reviewed today on an increased level of violence against women and girls during the COVID-19, which amplify the already existing gender inequality. And we also learned today and hear a lot that home isn't a safe place for everyone. The suspensions of GBV preventions, the response programming, which all increase and reduce support services for GBV survivors during this COVID-19. So why partnering with women rights actors and women rights organizations? I think my intended question for all of you today is why not? It is evident that women rights actors and organizations have been responding to GBV in their communities with or without the recognition from the international communities. They are there, they live there, and they work there in their communities long before the COVID-19 strike and long before any crisis in the world. They are also local leaders in their own communities and understand the context, the challenges, and the entry point for establishing critical GBV services. And most importantly, by the virtue of their long-standing presence in the communities, they often have already established trust that are very important to support GBV survivors. And through their links of communities members, the networks, they ensure that GBV survivors are supported and access to information about available service. They have proven to be a critical partners in GBV preventions and emergency response and the preparedness effort from the onset on this recent pandemic, despite the uncertainties and the limitations of the COVID-19 information early in the year, whereas many of the East Africa countries reported the first cases of the COVID-19 around March 2020. Women rights actors and organizations have already been working to respond to the needs of women and girls, even in that early times of the pandemic in their communities. From the BLTG project, not only that we learned that partnering with women rights actors and women rights organizations is critical, we also learned that an ongoing partnership and an engagement in emergency preparation work is very important. The project has been engaging with members around 60 organizations in the 3 regions over the past 3 years ago. And of course, with the longer histories of the IRC work on sharing capacity for our GBV emergency response program model. But within the BLTG, we also continue to emphasize this multi-year capacity sharing and ongoing technical support and exchange learning over time in the area of GBV in emergencies with our partners, rather than just one time of training. The multi-year capacity sharing has more significantly impact on women rights actors and organizations' abilities to immediately apply more rapid effective response to the GBV in the COVID-19. We receive feedback from the members as well that the accessibilities and the ease of use of the technical resources throughout the project have been very helpful and useful to contextualize to their response during the COVID-19. The overtime's engagement in preparation work and the support in the preparedness training reveal not only GBV technical capacities, but also organizational readiness to respond in a crisis. Many of the project members had focused on development contexts and the engagement in the project enable specific skill and knowledge for GBV in emergencies that's strengthening the rapid effective response to their COVID-19 programming adaptation. The capacity built over time, it's also helped in the immediate response by the organization and not waiting for the emergency to occur, as Beth also emphasized in the beginning how important on the preparedness work. So not only the readiness to maximize the services during the COVID-19 by our member, they also take the further step and being prepared and being ready to even advocate for an inclusive GBV services during the COVID-19 that are look out for women and girls regardless of their diversities, their age, abilities, cultures, identities in this difficult time. And through the strong partnership, they felt support, empowered, and confident to play a key role as the GBV expert to support women and girls, to support their peers, and they also became a key stakeholder in a wider response and recovery in their context. We also learned that strong partnership enable a continuation of services with less interruption. In my conclusion, effective response require continuous preparedness plan and preparation work with a strong partnership with women rights actors, women rights organizations, and networks at the forefront, who are the first ever responder to GBV in their communities. And in our collaborations between IRC and the LPG project partners, we have seen the tangible impacts on the lives of women and girls and GBV survivors. Most BLTG partners have reported that they have been more intentional in involving women and girls, participations in the program design and implementation than in consultation. Before the project, they may be looked at women and girls as one group, but throughout the engagement, we have applied intersecting approach, in which mean different barriers and access to services, especially in their programming adaptation during the COVID-19 are taking into consider. And the importance of working in collaboration and building a network of women rights actors led to a strong referrals and support system that's centering response action to prioritize women and girls' well-being, safety, and protection in the COVID-19 from the importance of local partners. And answer to the call to action by June from the beginning. That's all from me for now. Thank you.
I think your message is just so critical to everything. Instead of looking at populations who are displaced and in need of services as just clients, they know each other in ways that we never will. And so empowering them to support one another through systems and support, again, just makes good sense. And it's the right thing to do. So thank you so much for bringing that forward, the question forward of not why would we, but why would we not? And I think that's a great grounding for today's discussion. So thank you. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Sarah Ashraf. And Sarah is the Director of Maternal, Newborn, Reproductive Health and Emergencies at Save the Children. She's been working in the humanitarian field for over 20 years and is currently supporting Save the Children's emergency health programs in Yemen and Pakistan. She's specifically focusing on reproductive health and emergencies in that work. Sarah also does research in protracted humanitarian situations and health system strengthening in fragile settings. So Sarah, it's our pleasure to turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Hello, everyone. It's a privilege to be on this event today in the memory of Jen, who was a very close friend, Save the Children. I and my colleagues have had the privilege of working with her in the field and knowing her for more than a decade. And we hope to continue in this work in the energy that she had for it and the dedication that she had for it. So for Save the Children, I'd like to just first share maybe in summary how Save the Children's approach is for GBV in humanitarian crises, and then go on to sharing 2 or 3 examples from the field. Save the Children looks at trying to integrate GBV programming in the field within all the other programming that is happening. So a focus very much on looking at how frontline workers in the field can be can be empowered so that they can provide services as they provide other reproductive health services through health facilities. Also looking at how programming can be integrated with our other sectors like protection, like livelihoods, like education, and everything else that we know is so much interlinked with GBV programming and the issues and the underlying causes behind GBV. We also are aiming at looking at which local organizations on the ground, as well as the ministries of health who are there, how can they really contribute to this programming for GBV? Because it is pretty obvious that if gender-based violence service provision is not part of the protocols and the strategies of a subnational Ministry of Health or a national Ministry of Health, it is very unlikely that frontline providers will be really able to provide services and will have the confidence to work with survivors. So this is another lens that we look at GBV through. So it is a long road. I think there are a lot of challenges, and challenges are very specific to the context that we work in. This is what we have seen. It really depends on the humanitarian crisis, on how long it has been there, how complex it is, what are the other interrelated issues with particular contexts. So within that, I'd like to share 3 examples. My first example is from Yemen, from the south of Yemen. So trying to work with the Ministry of Health, and we wanted to understand better the situation with GBV, and in particular with SGBV, and wanted to ensure that we can help the subnational Ministry of Health in the south to develop strategies and protocols that can then help them and work with other stakeholders, but also fundraise for better services for GBV on the ground. So we have been doing a study which kind of coincided with the happening of the COVID pandemic. So we were lucky enough to maybe collect most of our data before the COVID pandemic hit. And so we are now at the point where we're analyzing results from that study. But it is showing us a lot of learning. I can't share too many of the results now because we're still concluding our analysis, and we'll be able to share those later on. But it definitely is bringing up trends that are maybe similar to a lot that we know about GBV in conflict settings, but also a lot of new trends where we can see that there's a lot more at stake than what we have seen in past. So in this trend, we see how, again, what Jeanette said, frontline responders are really women and women organizations who've been there for years. It's very obvious. They're the ones who are doing most of the work. They have the trust. They're able to link up with all the different sectors and aspects to provide services. We're also seeing that although women and girls are still at a very high risk, boys and adolescent boys are also amongst the group that are equally high risk, in particular in this study. So the study that we actually undertook in collaboration with an academic institution in Holland, the Royal Tropical Institute of Netherlands, KIT, and it was their technical expertise that helped us lead the study on the ground. I would like to just read a quote that is from one of the adolescents who was part of this study in one of the areas, and I quote, "If this was happening in other countries, if something like this happened to a child, half the earth would know and would demonstrate. No light has been shed on us, which means that everything has become something normal." So this is from a teenager at one of the study sites. So she's talking about sexual violence. She's talking about what she sees in her community and what she observes. So I would be very happy at a later stage to share more on this study and also to share how we will be able to use the learnings from this study with the Ministry of Health, who have been very close collaborators with us and with the University of Kid in executing the study on the ground, and will also have committed already that they will work towards seeing how strategies can be built into a health system to respond better to GBV. My other example is from Rwanda. Um, in Rwanda, we work at the camp, at the Mahama camp, where we have a health center. We provide services, primary healthcare services, but very much integrated with reproductive health services. And through that program, we were able to establish youth and adolescent programming. So Save the Children was able to conduct research through a sense maker approach, which is an app and a mobile application platform where adolescents were able and others were able to share their experiences and share their stories, and also talk about their ability to access services uh, during a COVID-19 pandemic. And lots of stories have been shared. 780 stories have been shared on this SenseMaker platform, and almost most of them are adolescents between the age of 10 and 19. And I will again share one of the stories that we have seen. I will start now. I quote, "I went to the doctor. I was shaking with a fever 3 days after. I got a checkup and was given medication to take with me home. After taking it, I had a miscarriage and was bleeding. While at the hospital, I spent 2 days without seeing the doctor. I felt disappointed and chose to go back home because I did not receive the kind of services I needed. They came to take me home before I healed. I bled for 2 weeks. I healed from home. Our neighbors were the ones that gave me medicine." And she is between the age of 15 and 19, and is a refugee who was at the camp and had to go to the hospital because she could not be treated at the health facility in the camp. Um, My third example again is from Colombia. In Colombia, we again have a health center that caters for girls and women coming from the Venezuelan crisis into Colombia. And a range of services are provided at this health center. So there is antenatal care, postnatal care, family planning, STI treatment, and prevention of mental health, psychosocial issues, gender-based violence as well, and case management. So this particular health center continued working actually through the COVID pandemic, although we all know that Colombia was one of the countries hard hit by the pandemic. The program was able to set up all the precautionary measures within the health center, and which allowed not only the frontline workers to have confidence to continue providing services during the COVID pandemic, but also maybe trust built within the communities that came for services, because they were able to see that it was a safe space to access services. Again, I guess my concluding remarks from the three cases, I think a number of things are very, very key, which have come up with my other colleagues also. I think building trust is really, really important. And then when that trust is built, we have seen in the field, if that trust has built because we had midwives who were providing family planning services and were well known by the women in the community and could counsel well, so the trust had been built, or whether that trust was built because of other services that women came for, immunization for their children or nutrition services for their children. Wherever there is that trust, women and girls will come for GBV services as well. And when they come, I think the question is, what does the frontline health worker have in hand to provide them? And that is a very big gap and challenge in the field. Frontline workers are not well equipped. They don't necessarily have the right training, the right skills. They don't have the supplies on hand to manage and treat. And above all, maybe they also don't have the confidence to manage such cases because of everything else that is attached to them, the legal aspect, the police side, the criminal side, the fact that Ministry of Health has not given them a backing of strategy or protocols that they can clearly work with, or they don't have the referral systems outlined for them. So I think it's very, very important for us in the field to empower frontline workers. It's very important for us to work with the ministries of health on this aspect, like you said, Beth, with the costed implementation plan. And it's also very, very important to also work with communities. We have known that communities have very limited information of what their aspects are once a survivor has gone through what she or he has, what is available for them in terms of services. So Save the Children is also then committed, and we have been doing a lot of capacity building in collaboration with UNFPA in different countries, but also globally, to try to empower those frontline workers, and hope to continue to work through the health system and through local organizations and women on the ground who work for their communities to further GBV programming in humanitarian crises. Thank you.
That was
Over
really,
to you, Beth.
thank you, Sarah. That was profoundly moving. We have time now for a discussion among all the panelists, and I have some questions to ask, but I hope you'll ask each other questions too. So it's just much more of a conversation. You've all had incredible experiences in the world and are doing such important work that I think that you'll know better what to ask of each other as well. But before we get to that, I just want to remind people who are with us today that we'd love to hear from you as well. You can submit your questions directly to MHI, that's Maternal Health Initiative, MHI, at wilsoncenter.org. And again, please include your name, your title, and your affiliation so we know with whom we're speaking in this process. But I guess I'd really, Sarah and Jeanette, like to start with you and some of the things that you talked about, because I think it heart of both of your efforts really is that word, Sarah, trust. I mean, these are women, girls, boys who have every reason not to trust the people around them in their communities if they've been victims of violence, particularly within their home. And yet we need to build trust in systems and in response so that their community members, frontline service workers, everybody can provide the services to help them heal. And so I wonder what you've seen work in this effort to empower those people in those institutions who've been displaced along with those in need of services. How can we, working in international organizations, provide that support and yet step back to let the community, use their resources, use their knowledge and relationships to continue to build that trust, to continue to heal? Jeanette, maybe we'll turn to you first and ask what you've seen be effective, and then we'll ask Sarah to join as well.
Thank you so much, Beth. So from the learning from the Building Local Thinking Global project, that the factors that actually enable successful collaborations between international organizations or NGO with the women-led organization to ensure the effective response in GBV during emergencies were, I think, from the beginning, the mindset has to change. For example, in the BLTG project, together with the coalitions, we define the way of working that stem from the feminist through the practice. So we created that shared value and vision of this partnership that listen to and value the expert of women rights actors and women rights organizations and networks. And we also meaningfully engage with the member, underpinned by a strong base of collective of activisms, solidarities, and is accountable for women and girls in the communities. I think another successful factor is also that you actually share that identifications of the priorities for capacity sharing, resources need for the members' organizations, and which is all of which are the CSO working on violence against women and girls. And we ground our work in sharing feminist principles and our new rules of engagement to shift things, the powers and the resources to women CSO networks. Empowering women rights actors, which is we all know that also can improve the communities-based resilience and protection in particular. They also reach to the hardest group to reach, which could be marginalized in the communities as well. So I think feminist principles and approach quite stem the successful of this project, where the members also feeling very flexible that the project recognize also the other priorities and competitive work that they also have for their own mandates and organizations as well. I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, and I'll turn it to Sarah to see what more she would like to add.
Yeah, I think I would just maybe focus on 2 points. I think I agree with you, Jeanette. It is a mindset change. So really looking at what's happening on the ground. I think we tend to focus on and kind of our guidelines to what we know, but I think it's very important to really study our contexts and understand what's happening and who's part of everything and how are all the issues interplaying, leading to GBV and then leading after GBV, what is actually affecting service provision. I think that's very important because it's unique to each context. And that's where sometimes we go in with, with our, how would I say, programmatic things we know how to do. And then we go there, we try it, and then we're surprised that, oh, this didn't work here. The other point I think that I feel is really, really critical is within capacity building is not focusing so much just on the one-time trainings that are very important, but I think also on mentorship, on having an approach where we empower either local organizations or we change the approach to go and keep working with the same providers, helping them to walk through what they have learned and to actually apply it, because learning something in a classroom we know is very different, and then applying it in their setting, in their clinic setting, and working with different survivors who obviously have many or a very different story from each other, as I realize how to manage that, how to work with them. So I think it's also about mentorship. It's also about kind of a longer term relationship.
Yeah, Joan, you're nodding your head vigorously, and I know the call to action is really asking for a change of mindset for a full spectrum of activities.
Yeah. I know, I think as I was listening, I was thinking about the reality that we still can get pushback around the notion of gender equality work being humanitarian work. And so there's still too many actors who may say, too many colleagues who may say, you know what, that's not humanitarian, that's development, long-term development work. And I think that it's getting better, no question about that. And I think it's always good to quote the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, right? Because he says often, gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls are at the core of principled and effective humanitarian response. And I think we've heard why, right? From my colleagues here, the central role that women play as first responders, the centrality of their thinking, planning, and knowledge around what works, et cetera. And so if you're not really building those gender equality approaches into the work, then it's going to be less effective. It's going to have less impact. It might even be detrimental, depending on how you're doing it, right? So if you're thinking about what's effective, what's going to help the most people in the most effective way, then integrating gender equality into humanitarian action has to be standard operating procedure. Yeah. And we have the tools, we have the policies. It's really about that accountability for implementation. And I think that's what all of us need to push, getting to that point where it is standard operating procedure and it's well-funded standard operating procedure, I would say.
That's great. Christine, I want to make sure you have a chance to participate in this discussion as well. I know these are core values for CARE as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And I think Sarah's points about having the long-standing relationship is really key, and that's something I think CARE tries to build on, both in its development and humanitarian settings, so kind of bridging this gap when emergencies hit, so building those relationships initially, seeing how we can work with women's groups, so that when crisis hits and when we're in the situation where we need to work to address the needs in that crisis, and we already have that relationship with the groups. And just to go also to the point I think Sarah made about sort of the one size fits all model, kind of going in with our programs and then sort of expecting it to work, or trying to see that one program in one context will work in another. I think this is really where CARE's Women Lead in Emergency approach sort of came from, and I touched on this bit in the introduction. But the aim is really for us to work with sort of nascent groups, so faith groups, church groups, village saving and loans groups, so not sort of official established women's groups, but really just local community groups, and work with them to address the key barriers that they're seeing in times of crisis, and then CARE sort of taking that facilitation role, enabling role to support them to address those barriers based on the actions that they wish to take. So not having a prescribed list of activities or programs, but really responding to what they wish to do. And I think just maybe to give an example of where this has worked, we've been working on the Women Lead in Emergencies projects in Uganda with South Sudanese refugees in the West Nile region. And that's been the longest pilot that we've had so far since 2019. And in the communities there, women's role was really focused on collecting food and making sure that food was available for the family, and therefore going to the food distribution sites. Humanitarian agencies placed the food distribution point 10 kilometers away from the communities. So when working with the women's groups, they highlighted this as a key barrier in terms of a burden on their time, but also many reported abuse and attacks along the way.
Right.
So the group themselves highlighted this to humanitarian actors, and when things didn't change, they sort of got together with the community, with men and community leaders, to sort of have a peaceful boycott on the food distribution. And this eventually led to change, and the food distribution point was moved. And so this not only had a big impact on the women's group, on women collecting food and mitigating their risks, but it also created kind of a visibility of that group and respect for them in the community as being kind of leaders and peacefully and respectfully being able to mitigate some of the barriers that they were seeing in that crisis. So yeah, we really try and ensure this approach is ground up and working on the priorities that women and girls are facing.
Yeah, I think that just pointing out that 10 kilometers was kind of a ridiculous expectation to get food would be enough, but the fact that they found a way to both as a community come together and then raise that credibility as a part of it, it's a positive outcome. But just learning those lessons of just sort of basic human response seems so fundamental. And Sarah, I think your comment from the young woman in Yemen who said no light had been shed on them, so everything had become normal. Now that's really a haunting comment about how the incredible circumstances that people are living in, and all of your efforts to really mitigate some of this and shine a global light on what needs to happen and what you've learned along the way for these processes. And I know that we've had a number of questions come in now, and I wanted to turn it over to our Wilson Center colleagues. Sarah's still experiencing some technical difficulties, so our colleague Dakshita is going to be stepping in, and I humbly asked Dakshita to say her full name for us because I want to respectfully have it be introduced. So Dakshita, I want to turn over to you, please, and for the following questions.
Sure, thank you, Beth. Yes, I'm Dakshita Ramanarayanan from the Maternal Health Initiative, and I'll start out with 2 questions, and anyone can take these on if you'd like. So first, in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, what would you recommend as foreign policy actions that the US can take to support survivors of gender-based violence globally and tackle root causes of violence, and also put in place protections for women and girls before the next crisis arrives? Next, how do we bridge the gap between institutional level, policy level, and structural changes, and the changes needed in attitudes and behaviors of people?
Shall I take one on say something about the foreign policy actions? I guess I would say one of the first things we're all looking forward to is renewed support from the US government for sexual and reproductive health services. So I think that will be hugely important. I think on GBV, I think the US remains the leading donor probably. I think what we always can do better, and we hope to see better funding for GBV. But on the policy side of things, I think it's also really important to see sort of renewed US leadership in the field, in global fora around these issues, sort of lead, not just doing, but also leading in a very high profile way from an advocacy perspective with fellow governments and so on. So I think making this a priority in our foreign policy engagements, both the multilateral and bilateral engagements, is really important, and stepping up the effort on GBV, and especially stepping up the effort, reversing the effort on SRH and really making that a priority again, I think is hugely important.
Yeah, Joan, I'm sorry to speak in advance of you. I just wanted to echo that, you know, the chilling impact of a particular political perspective coming from the United States is felt around the world. And
Yeah.
And it's because of that that it's especially critical. And where I would also encourage that there be immediate action is to ensure that the United States no longer blocks access to abortion for women who are victims of sexual violence. That's allowed by US law. It's allowed morally. And all of us should stand behind that to ensure that that's one of the first things that happens when the United States can rejoin these conversations in a constructive way. So I'll step out of the way now, but I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that as well.
Hi, sorry, I'm having my hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I just would like to echo John's on the need for support from the policymakers and donors. I think, if I'm not mistaken, OCHA has been sharing on their financial tracking services figure around 2018 that indicated 8.74% of a global humanitarian funding was allocated to local and national actors.
Yeah.
It may be increasing a little bit from 2017, or I think nearly 3%, and then about 2% from 2016. But among all of these 8.74% something, it's very small that actually get into women rights actors and women rights organizations. I think we all know that the international communities, policymakers, donors have the most influence and powerful organized collective, any policies making, any funding or platform or fora. But I just want to ask all of us, for the international communities, for donors, for policymakers to be conscious about those priorities when you actually would like to send support or synergies, the strategies and everything on which priorities that we are amplifying, and how women rights organizations and women rights actors are engaged, and that power in the equal decision making and priorities are also set from there as well. Like to center your policies and your funding to the needs and the priorities of women rights organizations and women rights actors, and amplifying their voice and not yours. Thank you.
Yeah.
Christina, I think you had.
Yeah, no, I think I echoed Jane and Jeanette's comments there. I think two key things is just one is listening to women, girls, and at-risk groups that are affected by crisis, and really taking on board what they're saying their needs and priorities are, and then being able to fund and provide resources for those priorities. I mean, I mentioned earlier that CARE conducted 54 rapid gender analyses for COVID-19, and the teams put together a collation of these findings, and I think there was 6,200 women as part of all of the data collection put together. And across the board, gender-based violence concerns and concerns for access to services were highlighted. So we know that we need to prioritise gender-based violence prevention, risk mitigation and response in the earlier stages of the emergency. And as Jane mentioned with the call to action, having that right from the start, so not having it as an afterthought, but really noting that from the beginning, making sure they're part of the core and initial response, but then making sure that we do fund this as a priority, and making sure we fund the local women's organisations that are also taking kind of a big bulk of the action in humanitarian crises. So yeah, the message to really make sure that we can ensure consistent support for GBV prevention, care and mitigation services in all humanitarian crises, and particularly ongoing now in COVID.
Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, just maybe one thing to add for the second question that was on the gaps of within policies and institutions. And I think that when a crisis happens, even if it's in its acute phase or becomes a chronic humanitarian situation, I think the attention of many of the key decision makers inside a country, and even donors who are funding or international organizations are working, the attention is very much divided because of all that's happening within that crisis. I think it's very important for us to focus on a lot of this before a crisis hits. So I think the preparedness part, we talk about preparedness, we talk about a lot of times of tangible things like, you know, positioning supplies, training, and all of that, which is all important. But I think maybe it's also important to look at policies and strategies and way forward in a preparedness space so that attention can be brought to GBV and other sensitive areas that are so important. Because during a crisis, I feel like there's so much else happening and attentions are very much divided. In a crisis like Yemen and Syria, everything is equally important and everything is not there. So like, how on the table for prioritization, how do you vouch for one and not the other? And I think that is an issue. So maybe preparedness should also include working on policies and strategies and institutions.
Joan?
I totally agree with Sarah. But I was something else that I think Jeanette, actually several of you said, reminded me back to the call to action. And it's this issue of how ensuring that local organizations have access to direct funding, have access to resources. And I feel like sometimes on the global side, we raise it always as an issue. We say there are multiple barriers to it. And then things sort of continue. And so I guess I have a hope that under the call to action, since that does include most of the major donors, that we can use that coalition really to see if we can, among the donors, which also includes UN agencies, of course, and INGOs, depending on the relationship, but that we can really dig into that issue of the barriers and really say what, practically speaking, can be done, what mechanisms can be put in place to do a much better job of ensuring that local organizations have access to funds, that they're not competing with the major NGOs for the same pot of money, et cetera. That when we build capacity, they may well have the capacity to do the programming. They might need capacity on managing money and that sort of thing. Do we focus on that? So I have hopes that with the emphasis on localization and the call to action second roadmap, that we might see some good donor commitments and donor action on breaking down some of these barriers. It's probably not a single solution, but that we have some creative approaches that really allow us to make progress, because we recognize it, but it's still, those barriers are still too often there. So that's my hope for call to action part 2 on that issue.
Great, I think it's an important point. Jeanette?
Sorry, I just want to also still echoing John around when we talked about working with local women organizations or women rights actors, we only focus on the technical know-how. We didn't actually, you know,
they may have.
Of course, but the operational capacities is also something that needs to be bring up on the table as well. Most of them are right now facing a very short-term funding that more or less that they can't retain a good staff, they can't invest in their staff, they can't invest in their operational costs and programming. So international NGO following the heavy requests on interventions and technical areas and left them without the means to also strengthen their organizations to be strong, to also implementing and serving for women. And so I think that's also very important to see in the future. And also my hope that when we talked about supporting and investing in the technical area, the operational also need to be go hand in hand when the support and the funding come for the women rights organizations and actors.
Thanks. I just wanted to loop back as well to something that Sarah said about preparedness. Many of you were maybe with us last week when we launched an SRHR Preparedness Toolkit, and all the organizations that are here today also were partners in that process as well. And what that toolkit tries to do is to put some sort of framework for development actors to think through what do you need to do to be prepared for a crisis. What we found from EPI 2020 and when we talked to the leads on family planning in government and ministries, that most of them had no contact within their own government with those who were preparing for crisis. And so part of what the toolkit tries to do is encourage a certain pathway to interrogate systems, to say, what are we planning for? Does it include SRHR? Does it include contraception? Are we ready for sexual violence? And if not, what do we need to do to better prepare ourselves for this, knowing that it's just a matter of when, not if, a crisis will hit. So just wanted people to know that there are assets and resources from every organization here out there to try and support all of these aspects. But again, you know, to Janet, your point and the point everyone is making, it's about ensuring that local actors have access to information, resources, and processes to enact these things themselves. Christina, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to jump in as well.
No, I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I agree with Jeanette on the kind of the operational side as well. So just having not sort of overwhelming groups when a crisis happens and we need to implement particular activities or a project or an intervention, but having that long-standing relationship, having the funding available in the preparedness stage, but supporting them to build the capacity in the long term. So not just having short-term funding that focuses on a particular intervention, but really having flexible longer-term funding that allows us to build these relationships, build capacity for then when the next crisis strikes, which inevitably in most cases will.
Great. Dikshita, I think we have more questions that came in.
Sure, I've got two more questions that anyone can jump in on. So first, can you speak to the inclusion of men and boys in getting to the solutions to gender-based violence? So do you maybe have some examples of how men and boys have previously been included in these interventions and what we need to do going forward? Next, what is the role of frontline healthcare providers for gender-based violence services, and how can we help them be more confident in addressing the needs of the communities in addressing gender-based violence?
Go for it, Christina.
Just thinking of a good example, I think from our Women Lead in Emergencies project, it did start out as a pilot and we worked predominantly with women's groups, but it got to the stage where the women themselves were requesting that men and boys and community leaders were engaged a bit more in the approach. So that's become a bigger part now of the model itself. But one way we do it, we work with the women's groups to identify which men they would like to engage as part of the process. So they still have the kind of the power and the agency to kind of direct the approach and direct their action plans by identifying key stakeholders, men, different initiatives, and the barriers that maybe they see in the community between the genders, and when looking at social norms and the barriers that come with that. So I think that's been seen as quite a positive way of having women still leading in the approach. And when the boycott that I mentioned earlier with the food distribution, so the women's group were able to mobilise the men that were engaged in the Women Lead approach to come and support that, and also community leaders, refugee camp administration who are largely male, to support them with that, and they did, and they have been supporting women in kind of mock elections that they're holding when the groups are looking at gaining skills and experience in running for local positions. So I think there's positive examples there of where kind of a whole of community engagement has worked well.
Jeanette?
Hi. Thank you. I just would like to echoing what Christina is saying, and also would like to share the program that the International Rescue Committee has with engaging men through accountable practices. If you like to access to these resources, please go to gdvresponders.org and you will find the whole programs and package here. The approach is that we consult with women and girls, centering their voice and identify what is the key issue that's happening around safety and protections and their well-being, engaging, involving with the perpetrator or with men and boys in general. And with those identifying issues, we then work with the communities, volunteers, and the communities group, including men and boys themselves, to work with the group of men and boys in role models or in understanding the issue that was raised by the women, and then come to the solutions that also coming from the desire to change and to address the problem that were identified from the women. We also having the graduations of the groups of men and boys who go through this program, who also then become a role model that also cascading and really leading through example on how to end violence against women and how to respect women and girls in their communities to example and not just in the classroom. Thank you.
When Christina was talking, I was thinking that that example of the food distribution points also reminds us why it's so essential to have women in leadership committees making the decisions on the front end, because maybe the distribution point wouldn't have been so far away if women had had a chance at well, A, if the guidelines had been followed, maybe that would have been a good thing because they're not supposed to be that far away. But B, you can be sure that if women were on those leadership committees in the camp or whatever, they probably would have pointed that out from the get-go. So it's a reminder that you can be so much more effective on the front end if you have women in leadership positions when these decisions are made.
Sarah?
Yeah, I can probably attempt to answer the second question on the role of the frontline providers. I have totally seen in the field, the frontline providers are the first responders to whom survivors come. And it's usually where they think or they trust or have a little bit of trust is where they'll go. And so it's very important for the frontline providers to their capacity to be built, for them to have the skills and the supplies that they need. Also for them to have a backup mechanism where they can call back and ask if they're confused about something, because clinically and also socially, we know a lot of things are attached to a survivor coming for services. They might not have all the answers. And then a backup from their Ministry of Health. I think it's very, very important because in many countries, if we look at the rules and the regulations, we realize that when survivors come, there's always that legal aspect. So either they have to first inform the police or go to the legal side or come with a form, or if they come to a very large hospital, we know that there are formats that have to be filled, have to be signed. All these are barriers for them to access services. And it's also a barrier for the frontline provider. There's a fear factor for them really to deal with all this and also provide a service. So I think all of this is where we have to step in and have to make it easier for them, and find ways which are not only well known, but also well established with the legal system, with the Ministry of Health. Again, I think the referral pathways have to be very clear. It would be a big help for frontline providers if they knew where to refer, not just for higher level health services, but also for the psychosocial care part, for the protection part, for other services as well, for legal and for whatever the survivor wants. So I think that I almost feel like frontline providers are kind of on their own at the moment. A lot needs to be done for them in order to build that confidence and to really ensure that they can provide a service without being afraid for themselves and for the survivors many times.
We're about to wrap up, but let's have Jeanette say our last word here.
Yeah, I just cannot stop to agree with Sarah on the important role that the health care workers, frontline healthcare workers, are playing, because as a woman who experienced GBV, seeking GBV services is quite stigmatized and also safety concerns around it. So when the woman actually going to a healthcare or health facilities, it already screened that first safety option for them, that, oh, she's actually maybe not well or do something else in the hospitals, that it's not only labeling to like a GBV service, oh, you are a GBV survivor. So I think the role that they can play can also extend beyond forensics evidence collections or medical examinations. But if they receive the right trainings, also from Sarah's comments, they can be also very compassionate. They can provide psychosocial first aid responder. They can provide a basic counseling, and then they can make the right referrals. And I think their role, especially in a refugee setting, is quite important, where the safety options or the mobilities in and out, or the services that are available, is under the restricted area. So I just couldn't agree more with you, Sarah. Sorry, Beth, taking the time.
No, I'm glad. It's great to end on such a passionate note, Jeanette. Thank you. Thank you for everything that you shared with us today. And I want to thank Sarah and Christina and Joan as well. From FB 2020, your friendship and your partnership have meant so much to us. And as we started out, we're here because of our work, because of the passion that all of you have in your work, and because of our friendship with Jen as well, and a desire to remember her, to continue to do this work on behalf of all of those who are displaced and in need of care and support. I think that's what motivates all of us to do this. So I just wanted to thank you for your partnership, and thank in particular the Wilson Center for inviting us all here today. And I know Sarah Barnes would love to say some closing remarks. We're really happy to have Dakshitha to do that for us. So Dakshitha, I want to hand it over to you again. And again, a sincere thank you to the Wilson Center.
Thank you, Beth, too.
Thank you, Beth.
And I'd like to give a final thank you to all of our panelists and our moderator for joining us today and for providing your insights on this important issue. Thank you also to the programs that co-sponsored this event, and to our AV team, and to all of you for watching and taking the time to be with us today. The event recording from today will be available on the Wilson Center event page by the end of the day or by tomorrow morning at the latest. We will also update our event page with quotes from today's speakers, and you can find additional work on gender-based violence and other issues of gender equity, health, and security on the .mom column on the New Security Beat blog. This event today was part of the Wilson Center's programming in parallel with the UN's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence. For more information on future events in the series, please visit gbv.wilsoncenter.org. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
it's
you.
a pleasure to be
Thank
with you all.
Thank you, Sarah. All right.
Bye.
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 Bye.